The basics are the most important. I can't tell you the number of massive messes and years of litigation that have occurred because somebody didn't pay enough attention to a document request from an auditor, and they basically just hit print and shipped off a whole bunch of crap, and they got terrible results on the first audit.
When a provider gets hit with an audit or an overpayment, what is usually happening behind the scenes that they might not understand?
DME is kind of in the same bucket as hospice and home care and a lot of other ancillary service providers, meaning that they are frequently at the top of the target list for the auditors. And most of that is not that people are bad intended, although there are bad actors in lots of different spaces.
What kind of separates providers who successfully defend themselves from those who struggle?
They have a very robust internal QC and compliance process to begin with. They perform internal audits, I'd say at least quarterly. They take random samples. They make sure that all of their people and processes are current and accurate.
If you could give every DME provider one piece of advice before their next audit letter shows up, what would it be?
The number one thing I'm going to tell you is that
All right, we are live, the number one DME podcast, Claim to Fame, and today we have a very special guest, Stephen Bittinger from Polsinelli. Welcome to the show, Stephen.
Hey, thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
Welcome, Stephen. Happy to have you.
So before we get started, we always like to let our guests kind of give a little bit of background story on who they are and what their company is, what you do. So I'll open the floor to you.
All right. Thank you, guys. I appreciate it. Well, so I'm an attorney, so I'll start with my ethical disclosures. I do not represent NikoHealth, and my participation in this podcast is not an endorsement of their services. But I am a healthcare partner at Polsinelli. Polsinelli is a national law firm. The heart of the law firm is focused on healthcare. And I'm also co-chair of their Administrative Procedure Act practice group. For all the non-lawyers listening, that's anytime you sue the government. So basically, I sue the government and payers for a living, which I love doing. In my entire career, I have represented providers against payers, defending audits and callbacks, and affirmatively suing payers for unpaid or denied claims. I lead a team of about 19 across the country. So many DME suppliers are very familiar with Medicare's UPICs or SIUs from commercial payers. We defend those types of actions on a regular basis. So glad to be on.
Awesome, Stephen. Thanks for that intro. Kind of to kick this off, when a provider gets hit with an audit or an overpayment, what is usually happening behind the scenes that they might not understand?
Well, so we'll zoom out real quick. And so DME is kind of in the same bucket as hospice and home care and a lot of other ancillary service providers, meaning that they are frequently at the top of the target list for the auditors. And most of that is not that people are bad intended, although there are bad actors in lots of different spaces. Most of it is due to the frequency of regulatory change, the frequency of reimbursement change, and because it's really complex. And sometimes it's hard to get people to comply with all of the complexity of rules. So when a DME supplier ends up the target of an audit, both commercial or government, it is really because the payer has done some data mining and they've determined that that supplier is an outlier for some reason, or the alternative is that that supplier is delivering some sort of supply that's on a watch list. So they're going after certain specific types of supplies, and you just happen to be, have them on your roster of what you are delivering.
Got it.
So what are the common mistakes that providers are kind of making when responding to audits that you're seeing from your side?
Well, so as a part of my team, we have in-house coding and compliance consultants, some of the best experts that I've ever found in the industry, and we just hired them, so they're on staff with us. The basics are the most important. I can't tell you the number of massive messes and years of litigation that have occurred because somebody didn't pay enough attention to a document request from an auditor, and they basically just hit print and shipped off a whole bunch of crap, and they got terrible results on the first audit. So the most important thing I can tell any DME supplier is to take your document production seriously. Like, QC the crap out of your records. And your number one job, this is going to make you crazy because you don't like auditors, but your number one job in responding to an audit is to make the auditor's life easy. You want everything organized and everything focused. You want everything in easy chronological order so they can read it quickly. Because the harder you make an auditor work, the more likely they are to deny your claims.
Interesting, Stephen. And when someone's dealing with an auditor, at what point should they consider bringing in legal counsel like yourself?
Well, so there's some real quick and easies. There's buzzwords and acronyms, right? We work in healthcare, so everything's an acronym. So the type of auditor is probably your first and easiest signal, right? So with commercial payers, it's a little more difficult because most of the audits all come from a SIU, Special Investigations Unit, or some other acronym that, they allege fraud, waste, and abuse. They'll handle both intentional based audits, meaning they really think somebody did this on purpose, or error based audits, meaning they just build something wrong or a wrong frequency or a wrong unit, those types of things. The ones that you really got to be worried about are government payers, right? But there's lots of different categories of government payers. So for DME suppliers, the number one nemesis are the UPICs, the Unified Program Integrity Contractors for Medicare, or if you get an audit by a Medicaid MFCU, that is the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit. Those ones you need lawyers for because they are hunting genuine fraud and they're pretty aggressive. I would say if it's not one of those primary categories, most of the time, if it's a commercial payer or something that looks odd, just error based, you can handle the production on the first round first. Second major red flag of when you need counsel is if they mention anything in either the request or the original findings regarding statistical sampling and extrapolation. So I have spent 15 years filing challenges to extrapolated overpayments. And for anybody listening who doesn't know what that is where they take a random sample of claims across a very large universe. They come up with an error rate, and then they extrapolate that error rate across the universe. So basically, it could be a sample with $15,000 worth of overpayments, but they make $1 million demand. That's when you need a lawyer because you're challenging the legal process by which they used the sampling and extrapolation.
Understood. And Stephen, what types of audits or reimbursement disputes are you kind of seeing more of right now? Are there any sort of trends?
Oh, well, there's the trends follow the evolving supplies. So I'll give you a kind of a historical one that I think, and this isn't hard to figure out, right? Somebody who reads the industry news for DME supplies will stay current on what the hot button issues are. But like continuing glucose monitors, CGM, right? So CGM got approved, huge wave in the market. Every payer thought they were being grossly overbilled for CGM, and they started auditing. So anytime that there's really a new supply that takes off, like is really hot, expect you're going to be audited.
Yeah, I've actually seen in the news a few specific products that it seems like, I guess maybe certain providers might be taking advantage of in, the system. It seems like, obviously very highly reimbursable products seem to get abused, right? And especially when they're kind of new to the scene. So it seems like what I've seen in the past where in wound care, there have been these like sort of amniotic type of wound care products that reimburse very highly. And I've seen a bunch of people get busted for some sort of Medicare fraud. Is that something you've seen recently as well?
Oh, I have lived and breathed the skin substitute wave for almost 6 years. I sure hope a DME supplier is not in the middle of that one because it's supposed to be a biologic device, not a DME supply. So,
Stephen, for providers who've never been through a serious audit, what should they know before it happens?
well, we'll just categorize serious as a UPIC, right? Because if we're
Yep.
talking about types of audits, that's probably the most deadly. And this is very hard, but we're going to go through some of the fundamental mechanics, right? So if you're a supplier, you are enrolled in Medicare, that is a privilege, not a right, right? So your enrollment is not a contractual right, right? It is a privilege to be enrolled in the Medicare program. And because the law defines it that way, the auditors really have a lot of control, right? So if they find a really high error rate on their initial finding, they can suspend your payments. So a payment suspension by regulation starts out as 180 days. So if your payer mix is really heavy on Medicare, question number one, can you survive 180 days without getting paid by Medicare, right? What is your payer mix? Right? So that's really important to understand. They can renew that 180-day suspension one more time up to 360 before the auditor has to either pass you to DOJ for formal investigation or make a determination to either terminate you or that you've shown sufficient corrective action and end the payment suspension. So that's probably the hardest weapon in their tool chest is payment suspension. So again, I'll go back to original document production really matters.
And going off this, and your answer might have already been part of the question I'm going to ask right now, but what kind of separates providers who successfully defend themselves from those who struggle?
So providers that successfully defend themselves, A, they have a very robust internal QC and compliance process to begin with. They perform internal audits, I'd say at least quarterly, right? They take random samples, they make sure that all of their people and processes are current and accurate, that they have all the different pieces of documentation that they need. If it's a supply that requires follow-up and collection of medical records from the ordering physician, you are following up and collecting the medical records from the ordering physician. You've really got to treat your LCD or NCD requirements as like a holy grail, right? You've got to have every piece of it in order because you don't know when an audit is coming. And if you get an audit for 100 records that is due in 3 weeks, it's a mad scramble to try to collect everything in 3 weeks, right? But if you have your house in order to begin with, you're much more likely to defend. Second major piece is you have a really good, clean production. You tell the story of your compliance, right? You have a solid, thorough cover page that talks about the supplies, talks about the coverage elements, tells an easy, tight story for the auditor, and then you line up all your exhibits and records in a very clean, readable fashion for that auditor so that it is very hard for them to find errors and deny your claims.
Good stuff, Stephen. And just to help some of the listeners, so a lot of providers might not fully understand statistical sampling and extrapolation until maybe they're facing this. Can you kind of simply explain this for our listeners a little bit more in depth?
Sure. So, all right, a couple more mean truths in the healthcare process. Here we
Love that.
go. So, look back periods create the magnitude of what the auditor's actions are. So let me explain. So commercial payers by contract generally have a 2-year look back period. So this may seem devious, but if you're the auditor and you see a problem, you don't start auditing when you see 4 months worth of a problem. You start auditing when you see 12 or 18 or 24 months worth of problem, because then they can have a larger overpayment recovery, right? They get a better ROI on the amount of work it takes to do the audit. So, our government, right? Medicare has a 4-year look back period. So that UPIC could be sitting on your claims data, watching it grow for 3 years before they audit, because then it's a really big target for them to come after. It's the same amount of work for them, whether they do 6 months or 4 years. So the look back period really is kind of the wave that the auditors target when we are trying to figure out how to limit exposure. That's why I say quarterly internal audits are so important, right? Because nobody's perfect, right? Everybody makes mistakes. We all are people. Processes derail. But if you internally audit quarterly, then you cut your risk down to a quarterly amount of reimbursement.
Understood. And I did want to ask you a question, sort of in the same vein that does come up in every episode regarding AI. Would you say that any payers are using AI and analytics to kind of identify claims for audit?
All of that. So, all right. I didn't answer Wayne's statistical sampling and extrapolation question, so I'm going to fold both of these questions into one.
Perfect.
Right? All right. So statistical sampling and extrapolation first was approved for use in this industry in 1986 by HCFA. If you're old enough to remember HCFA, then you're about my age, before it was CMS. And the long story short is, I want you to think of an elections poll, right? An elections poll that we all see on the news goes out and is supposed to randomly sample X number of people so that whatever the results are can be validly projected against a larger population, right? That's what polling is. Well, statistical sampling and extrapolation in the reimbursement claims is generally the same nature. So if we are talking about a UPIC with a 4-year look back period, statistics would say, okay, your minimum sample, if it's the same type of supply that we're looking at over 4 years, if there's 500,000 claims, is like 180 claims, right? It tells you mathematically how many you need to sample to extrapolate that error rate across 500,000. Now, the auditors bend the rules. Sometimes their samples are too small. They'll limit it to 60, but let's just say it's 60. So if they pull 60 random claims across 4 years and they determine that 30% of that sample are billed in error and you owe 30, whatever was paid on 30 claims, they take that 50% error rate and they apply it to the 500,000. Wow. So that is how a $30,000 sample overpayment turns into a $5 million extrapolated overpayment. Wow. Now, turn it to AI and algorithmic, right? So 4 years ago, I was defending a DME supplier against a MCO audit, and it was abundantly clear by the nature of the denial bases that this payer used a large language model to read the medical records and spit out denial bases. It hallucinated horrifically, like it grabbed a 25-year-old rule regarding submission of paper claims. Nobody's submitted paper claims in a long, long time. So it was pretty clear that this was not a current trained auditor asserting these denial bases. Long story short, we were able to reverse engineer the logic of the tool, and we challenged the payer. We filed the first federal lawsuit in the country against that MCO for violation of the Federal Medicaid Act. Long story short, I drew a 76-year-old federal judge who was very kind and said, I don't understand anything you're saying. There's got to be an arbitration clause around here somewhere. So we finished that one in arbitration. But since then, I have turned from sampling and extrapolation, which is still probably 30-40% of my work, to about 60 to 70% AI and algorithmic based litigation against the payers. So, what's really going on with algorithmic and AI? The payers are using it. The tools, they're using it on pre-auths, they're using it in adjudication. Basically, they are letting the tools determine variances faster, right? So while there used to be, humans checking variations, the tools are doing it and they're flagging suppliers sooner in a post-payment review. There are tools that are reading medical records, comparing what they see in the medical records and lining that up against the LCD or NCD requirements and making suggested determinations whether that claim should pass or fail. Now, most of them have got a person behind that tool making the final decision, but I can tell you we have cases where they're reading 300 pages of medical records in 1.2 seconds. And I don't know if I've ever met a person who can read that fast. I'm not sure that's a qualified clinical review. So we're litigating that. But let's be careful. AI is everywhere. I have suppliers and providers using AI and algorithmic tools also. I have them using it to read the referring medical records and suggest ICDs and other types of HCPCS. And so you got to be really careful, right? And what I will tell providers who are using any AI or algorithmic tools is that the liability vertical, basically that is who's responsible for the claim submitted, hasn't changed. So if there is an element of requirement for submission of a claim that is expressly a human being's responsibility, that human being with appropriate credentials needs to keep that responsibility. So in the name of efficiency, you cannot bypass your duties that are laid out in that liability vertical.
Interesting. Really
Yeah.
interesting.
So just real quick, Wayne, before you go. So does that mean basically that AI should be used like ancillary to help the human and not only rely on AI to output these, judgments or claims?
Yeah. So I'll give you two things, and I know we're running short on time. So AI is going to be a part of all of our lives in almost every fashion, right? So I use a closed database, Claude, to research and draft now, and I am working faster and smarter than I ever have in my life, right?
Sure.
It's going to be a part of our life, right? So, but ultimately, we've got to make people responsible because the tools can't be held liable. A company can be held liable. But if you are a provider, you're the one submitting the claim. Your number, your name is on the line. So no matter what tool or vendor you're using, you are the one that's ultimately responsible with the payer. So you've got to make sure you understand and control all of the parts that go into it. Now, final word, DME suppliers, there's something called the WISER program. And if you haven't done any homework on the WISER program, that's capital W, capital I, capital S, lowercase e, capital R, please Google it, right? The WISER program is a AI and algorithmic based pre-authorization review program that has been implemented by CMS. It's currently a pilot program in 6 states, and we are fighting this one tooth and nail. Yes, CMS has pre-authorization.
Wow.
Interesting.
This is gonna
It's a
be
lot.
a lot to
Yeah.
unpack for
Even
our
I'm
listeners.
learning a lot today, honestly. Question. So I know we're getting tight here on time. If you could give every DME provider one piece of advice before their next audit letter shows up, what would it be?
The number one thing I'm going to tell you is that everybody who's got anything to do with claim submission needs to understand the primary requirements under an LCD or NCD for claim submission. And you've got to have a QC process to make sure you have all required documents in hand before you submit that claim. And number two, you need an in-house, internal, quarterly self-audit program.
Boom.
Because you don't want to hire me. If you hire me, it's very expensive. I'm very good at what I do, but it ain't cheap.
That leaves us kind of a nice ending, Stephen. For those that may need you and need to leverage your services, how can our followers and communities get a hold of you if they need you?
Well, it's 2026, so Google me. My name is Stephen, Stephen Bittinger, Bittinger, and you'll find me.
Perfect.
Love it. Stephen, thanks so much for joining today. Really appreciate it. We learned a lot today.
Yeah, this is awesome, man. Thank you.
Thank you both.
Appreciate it.